Hey guys! Tonight we step into a world that adults rarely bothered explaining, because the children living in it had no choice but to accept it. A world where your toys were usually sticks, your classroom was a muddy field, and your future had already been quietly decided long before you were old enough to understand what the word future even meant. Tonight we explore what it was really like to be a child in medieval Europe. Not the version with cheerful castles, colorful festivals, and brave young squires destined to become legendary knights. Not the version where everyone somehow lives happily ever after beneath stone towers covered in colorful banners. But the ordinary version. The one lived by millions of children whose names history never recorded. Children who woke before sunrise, worked until sunset, rarely traveled farther than a few miles from home, and grew up believing that the tiny village around them was almost the entire world. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Pull the blanket a little higher. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes. You are not awakened by an alarm clock. There isn't one. You are not awakened by birds singing peacefully outside your window either. There is no glass window to let in the morning light so gently. Instead, you wake because someone else is already awake. You hear quiet footsteps moving across the packed dirt floor. Someone is feeding the fire before it dies completely. Someone else is carrying a wooden bucket outside. A baby begins crying somewhere beside you. The cottage is still dark. The air smells faintly of smoke that never truly leaves the building. Even when the fire burns cleanly, its scent settles into the wooden beams, the straw roof, your clothes, your blankets, and your hair. You have never known a home that smells different. You stretch carefully. Several other people are sleeping only inches away. Families do not usually have separate bedrooms. Privacy is almost unknown. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even relatives all sleep inside the same small building because warmth is easier to keep when everyone stays together. The first thing you notice isn't comfort. It's the cold. The fire burned low during the night to save precious wood. Until fresh logs begin catching, the room remains chilly enough that everyone stays wrapped in wool blankets just a little longer. Outside, dawn is only beginning. The village is already waking. You are somewhere in England, or perhaps northern France, or one of hundreds of similar villages scattered across medieval Europe sometime around the year 1250. You don't know the year. Nobody around you counts time that way. People remember events by harvests, by kings, by unusually harsh winters, or by the year the river flooded and carried away the mill. As far as you're concerned, life has always been like this. And tomorrow will probably look almost exactly the same. You are 8 years old. By modern standards, that sounds impossibly young. Here, it does not. Childhood exists. But it is much shorter than the version most people experience today. No one expects you to spend the next 10 years sitting in classrooms discovering your passions before deciding what kind of adult you want to become. Adulthood is already approaching. Quietly. Steadily. And everyone around you knows it. Except perhaps you. The day begins almost immediately. Nobody asks whether you feel ready. There are animals waiting to be fed. Water waiting to be carried. Wood waiting to be collected. Fields waiting to be worked. Life in the Middle Ages rarely paused simply because someone happened to be a child. And this is only the beginning. Let's talk about breakfast. Not because breakfast is especially exciting. It isn't. But because breakfast tells you almost everything you need to know about being a medieval child. In your world, breakfast might involve cereal, toast, eggs, fruit, coffee, or perhaps something grabbed on the way out the door because you're running late. Here, breakfast depends almost entirely on how well last year's harvest went. Imagine sitting on a rough wooden bench beside the fire. The room is brighter now. Thin streams of sunlight squeeze through tiny openings in the walls. There are no large glass windows. Glass exists, certainly. But ordinary farming families cannot afford such luxuries. The light enters wherever it can. Your mother stirs a black iron pot hanging above the fire. Inside is pottage. Again. Yesterday it was pottage. Tomorrow it will probably be pottage too. Pottage is less a recipe than an ongoing conversation between whatever food happens to exist and one large cooking pot. Oats. Barley. Beans. Cabbage. Onions. Perhaps a few herbs. Occasionally, if fortune smiles upon the family, small pieces of meat. Everything cooks together until it becomes one thick meal. Nobody complains. Complaining does not create more food. You receive a wooden bowl. No plates. No forks. No polished silver cutlery. Just a spoon carved from wood, and sometimes not even that. Bread accompanies the meal. Dark bread. Heavy bread. Bread that modern bakeries would probably struggle to sell because people would mistake its density for a manufacturing defect. Yet to you, this bread represents security. As long as bread remains available, life is manageable. When bread becomes scarce, people begin worrying. Children notice these things even when adults try not to show it. You take careful bites. Food is precious. Dropping it onto the dirt floor feels almost tragic. Nothing is wasted. Not crumbs. Not bones. Not yesterday's leftovers. Every scrap matters because producing food requires enormous effort. After breakfast comes water. Not because you're thirsty. Because someone always needs more water. The nearest stream sits nearly half a mile away. Perhaps farther. You carry a wooden bucket almost as large as your torso. The first few trips feel impossibly heavy. Eventually they become ordinary. Children begin helping with these jobs surprisingly early. Not because parents are cruel. Because families function like small businesses. Everyone contributes according to their ability. A 5-year-old might collect kindling. An 8-year-old carries water. A 12-year-old may already spend full days working in the fields beside adults. Nobody calls these chores. They're simply life. As you walk toward the stream, the village slowly awakens around you. Smoke rises from dozens of cottages. Dogs wander freely. Chickens seem determined to occupy every pathway at exactly the wrong moment. A blacksmith has already begun striking hot iron. The rhythmic ringing echoes across the village. Children greet one another. Not for long. There is little time for lingering conversations. Everyone has somewhere to be. Everyone has work. School. Perhaps. Perhaps not. Most medieval children never attend anything resembling a formal school. If your family is wealthy. If you belong to a monastery. If your parents believe education serves a practical purpose. Then maybe you learn to read. For most children, however, education happens differently. You learn by watching. By copying. By making mistakes. You discover which plants are edible because someone older points at them. You learn how to milk a goat because eventually someone hands you the bucket. You understand weather because you've stood beneath enough skies to notice patterns. Every lesson arrives attached to real life. There are no exams. Only consequences. Get something wrong. The family loses valuable time. Or food. Or tools. Sometimes much more. Yet children learn astonishingly quickly. Not because they're naturally wiser. Because they must. Life rewards competence. Every new skill makes you more useful. Every useful child becomes another pair of capable hands. And capable hands are among the most valuable possessions any medieval family can have. By the time the morning sun climbs higher above the fields, your day has already accomplished more physical work than many modern adults complete before lunch. And the hardest part hasn't even begun yet. Now let's talk about work. Because this is where modern childhood and medieval childhood begin moving in completely different directions. Today, people often ask children what they want to be when they grow up. In your village, nobody asks. Not because your dreams don't matter, but because your future is already becoming visible. If your father is a farmer, there is an excellent chance you will become one too. If your family keeps sheep, you will probably spend much of your childhood learning everything there is to know about sheep. If your parents weave cloth, Your small hands will eventually learn the same careful movements. Occupation is less a choice than an inheritance. And every ordinary morning brings you a little closer to it. Imagine walking into the fields just after sunrise. The grass is still wet with dew. Birds circle overhead. The air smells of damp earth. Adults spread across the farmland carrying wooden tools polished smooth from years of use. You are smaller than everyone else. But that doesn't mean you have nothing to do. Someone asks you to scare birds away from freshly planted grain. It sounds easy. Until you've spent 3 straight hours waving your arms every few minutes because another flock keeps arriving. Another child gathers loose sticks. Someone else watches the family's cow. An older brother helps repair a broken fence. Nobody stands around for long. There is always another task waiting. At first glance, it might seem unfair. By modern standards. Perhaps it is. But medieval families are not assigning work simply to teach responsibility. They are trying to survive. Every basket carried. Every bundle of firewood collected. Every animal watched carefully. Every weed removed from the fields. It all adds together. One child's effort may seem small. 30 small efforts can determine whether a family has enough food for winter. Children understand this surprisingly early. Not because someone delivers a long speech explaining economics. Because they watch. They notice worried conversations after poor harvests. They notice smaller portions during difficult seasons. They notice adults silently repairing the same shoes again instead of making new ones. Life teaches its own lessons. And those lessons arrive quickly. Of course. Work is not the only thing children do. They still laugh. They still race each other across open fields. They still invent games using whatever happens to be nearby. A stick becomes a sword. A smooth stone becomes treasure. A fallen tree becomes the greatest castle anyone has ever seen. Children have always possessed remarkable imaginations. That hasn't changed in thousands of years. The difference is that play rarely lasts all day. A game can end immediately if an adult calls your name. Nobody argues. You simply run over. Another chore has appeared. Another pair of hands is needed. Even the seasons shape your childhood. Spring brings planting. Summer brings endless work beneath the sun. Autumn means harvesting every possible crop before cold weather arrives. Winter changes everything. The fields finally grow quiet. Families spend more time indoors. Clothes need repairing. Tools need sharpening. Stories become entertainment. For many children, winter evenings are magical. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because after months of exhausting outdoor labor, everyone is finally gathered together beneath one roof. Grandparents tell stories they've heard since childhood. Parents laugh quietly. Babies sleep beside the fire. Outside, snow or rain covers the village. Inside, the fire crackles softly. For a little while, work can wait until morning. Those evenings become memories that stay with children for the rest of their lives. Because in a world where every day demands effort, even small moments of peace become extraordinary. And for medieval children, some of the happiest moments arrived not during great celebrations, but simply while sitting beside the fire. Listening to another story before sleep slowly carried everyone into another cold morning. Let's slow down for a moment. Because there is one part of medieval childhood that often surprises modern people more than almost anything else. Friendship. Not because children didn't have friends. They absolutely did. But because friendship happened differently. Imagine finishing the day's work just before sunset. The animals have been fed. The water buckets are full. The last tools have been carried back into the shed. For perhaps half an hour. Maybe a little longer. The adults are busy with evening chores. And suddenly, the village belongs to the children. You run toward the small open space between the cottages. Several other children arrive almost immediately. Nobody sends invitations. Nobody checks a calendar. Nobody asks whether everyone is free next Thursday. You simply appear. Because everyone lives only a few minutes apart. Games begin almost instantly. Someone throws a pine cone. Someone else starts chasing it. Within moments. Half the village is pretending to be hunters. The other half insists on becoming wolves. Rules change constantly. Nobody minds. The game continues anyway. There are no manufactured toys waiting at home. No shelves filled with brightly colored boxes. No batteries. No screens. No controllers. Entertainment begins with imagination. A stick becomes a knight's sword. Another becomes a shepherd's staff. Flat stones become coins. Acorns become livestock. Mud becomes anything your imagination requires. Remarkably, it is enough. Children laugh just as loudly, argue just as passionately, and invent worlds just as elaborate as children do today. The materials have changed. The imagination has not. Older children often watch younger ones. Not because adults told them to every minute, but because responsibility arrives naturally in small villages. A 12-year-old may already help carry a toddler. A 10-year-old teaches a younger child how to throw a stone properly. Skills pass downward almost constantly. Not through formal lessons, but through imitation. You copy what older children do. One day, someone younger copies you. Without realizing it, you have become the teacher. Of course, arguments happen. Someone accuses another child of cheating. Someone refuses to share. Someone pushes a little too hard during a wrestling game. Tears appear. 5 minutes later, everyone is playing together again. Small villages leave very little room for permanent enemies. You'll probably need each other tomorrow. And the day after that. As the sun sinks lower, parents begin calling children home. One voice echoes across the village. Then another. One by one, the games quietly disappear. Children race toward different cottages. Smoke curls into the evening sky. The smell of fresh bread and boiling pottage fills the air once again. The village grows quieter. Tomorrow will bring another long day. And everyone knows it. Yet before sleep arrives, there is still one part of childhood we haven't explored. Perhaps the most important part of all. Growing up. Because in medieval Europe, childhood ended much sooner than anyone expected. Now let's talk about growing up. Because childhood, as you understand it today, would seem remarkably long to most people living in medieval Europe. Imagine celebrating your 12th birthday. Except, you don't actually know it's your birthday. Very few ordinary families keep precise records of the exact day a child was born. You know roughly how old you are. So does everyone else. That is usually enough. By now, nobody sees you as a little child anymore. You are expected to work almost as hard as many adults. The tasks become heavier. The responsibilities become larger. Mistakes become more expensive. If you are a boy, you may begin learning a skilled trade. Perhaps the village blacksmith agrees to take you as an apprentice. Perhaps you spend years learning carpentry. Perhaps you remain on your family's farm, where every season teaches another lesson your father already knows by heart. The first months are exhausting. You carry tools, sweep workshops, fetch water, watch carefully. The master explains very little. Instead, you learn by observing. You repeat the same movement hundreds of times, then thousands. One day, without realizing it, your hands begin moving correctly on their own. Skill arrives quietly, not all at once. If you are a girl, your education continues just as intensely. You learn spinning, weaving, cooking, baking bread, making cheese, caring for younger children, managing a household that functions almost like a tiny business. Modern people sometimes imagine these skills as simple household chores. They were anything but simple. Keeping a family alive through winter required remarkable knowledge. How long grain could safely be stored? Which herbs eased illness? How to preserve vegetables? When to slaughter animals? How to repair clothing before it wore completely through? Every task mattered. Every mistake carried consequences. Marriage also appears much sooner than many modern people expect. Not necessarily immediately, but certainly earlier than today. Families begin discussing futures, land, property, partnerships. Children slowly become adults without any obvious moment separating one stage from the next. There is no graduation ceremony, no final school exam, no driver's license, no university acceptance letter. Life simply keeps asking more from you, and you keep answering. Yet despite the work, despite the responsibility, despite the uncertainty, young people still find ways to laugh. Village festivals arrive a few times each year. Music fills the air. Someone begins dancing. Children join first. Teenagers pretend not to enjoy themselves. Adults eventually join anyway. For one evening, the endless rhythm of work slows down. Stories are shared. Games return. Bread tastes sweeter. Even ordinary people smile a little longer than usual. Those celebrations become bright islands inside an otherwise demanding life. Then morning comes. The fields are still waiting. The animals still need feeding. The seasons continue moving forward exactly as they always have. And before long, you realize something surprising. The adults no longer speak to you like a child. Without noticing, you have crossed the invisible line. You are now one of the people responsible for keeping the village alive. And in medieval Europe, that responsibility rarely waited for anyone. Let's spend a little time inside your home. Because for all the work you do outside, everything begins and ends here. Imagine standing in the middle of your family's cottage. It is smaller than many modern living rooms. Yet 6, perhaps 8, sometimes even 10 people call this place home. The walls are made from timber woven together with branches and covered in mud. The roof is thick thatch. When it rains heavily, everyone quietly hopes it continues doing its job. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth. Not polished wood. Not stone tiles. Just generations of footsteps pressing the ground harder each year. At the center of the room burns the hearth. This is the heart of the house. Nearly everything important happens around it. Meals are cooked here. Stories are told here. Wet clothes are dried here. Children gather beside its warmth during cold evenings. Even when food is scarce, the fire gives comfort. Smoke rises slowly toward a hole in the roof. Some escapes. Some doesn't. Over many years, the wooden beams above become almost black. The smell of smoke settles into everything. You barely notice it anymore. It simply smells like home. Furniture is surprisingly simple. Perhaps one sturdy table. A few rough benches. Wooden chests holding the family's most valuable possessions. Those possessions are not gold, nor jewels. Usually they're practical things. A good iron knife. A sturdy cooking pot. A warm wool blanket. A carefully repaired pair of shoes. These are treasures because replacing them is difficult. Nothing is thrown away lightly. Broken clothing is patched. Broken baskets are woven again. Wooden bowls last for years. Even worn-out tools often receive one more repair before finally being abandoned. As a child, you quickly learn to care for everything you own. Because there may never be another one. Night slowly approaches. The family gathers once more. Today's work is finished. Tomorrow's work already waits. Someone stirs another pot of pottage. Someone repairs a torn sleeve. An older brother sharpens a farming tool. A younger child quietly falls asleep beside the fire before supper is even ready. Grandmother begins another story. You've heard it dozens of times. Perhaps hundreds. You still listen. Because stories carry more than entertainment. They carry memory, lessons, warnings, family history. Sometimes they speak of kings, sometimes of saints, sometimes of strange creatures said to wander forests after dark. Whether every story is true hardly matters. The stories remind everyone who they are. Outside, the village grows silent. Only an occasional dog barks somewhere in the darkness. The stars slowly appear above the rooftops. Tomorrow will look remarkably similar to today. And strangely, that consistency brings comfort. Life is difficult, but it is familiar. You know your family. You know your neighbors. You know every path through the fields. Every tree. Every stream. Your entire world fits comfortably within a few miles. You cannot imagine lands beyond the distant hills. Nor do you feel any particular need to. As far as you know, everything important is already here. And perhaps, for one small medieval child, it truly is. But not every child was lucky enough to remain in the safety of their village. Because beyond those familiar fields, the wider medieval world could be far harsher than anything home had prepared them for. Now let's leave the village. Not forever. Just far enough to understand something most medieval children eventually learned. The world was much bigger than they imagined. And much stranger. Imagine that one morning a group of traveling merchants arrives. You hear them long before you see them. Wooden wagon wheels creak against the dirt road. Horses snort impatiently. Dogs bark across the village. Children, naturally, are the first to run toward the excitement. Visitors are rare. Perhaps only a handful arrive each year. Everyone stops working for a moment. Not because the travelers are important. Because they bring news. One merchant has come from a town 2 days away. Another claims to have seen a city whose stone walls stretch farther than anyone in your village can imagine. Someone speaks with an unfamiliar accent. Someone else carries spices that smell unlike anything you've ever encountered. To you, it feels almost magical. The wider world suddenly becomes real. Until this moment, your universe has been astonishingly small. Perhaps 5 miles across. Maybe 10. You know every hill. Every stream. Every family. Every field. You could probably walk the surrounding countryside with your eyes closed. Now, strangers describe mountains taller than clouds. Ships larger than entire houses. Markets where hundreds of people gather every single day. You struggle to picture such things. Children ask endless questions. Have you seen a castle? Is the king really as rich as everyone says? Do dragons exist beyond the mountains? The adults smile quietly. Even they don't know many of the answers. News travels slowly. Rumors travel much faster. Sometimes the stories are true. Sometimes they've changed a little every time someone repeated them. By the time they reach your village, the truth and imagination have become close friends. The merchants unpack their goods. Bright pieces of cloth. Iron knives. Clay pots. Glass beads that sparkle brilliantly in the sunlight. You've never owned anything like them. You may never own anything like them. But looking costs nothing. Children gather around the wagon, eyes wide with curiosity. For a few hours, the ordinary rhythm of village life disappears. The outside world has arrived at your doorstep. Then, almost as quickly as they came, the travelers leave. The wagons disappear over the distant hill. The dust settles. The road grows quiet again. Life returns to normal. The animals still need feeding. The fields still require work. The water buckets are still empty. Yet something has changed. For the first time, you understand that your tiny village is only one small place in an unimaginably larger world. You may never see most of it. Many medieval people never traveled farther than 20 miles from where they were born. But now, whenever you look toward the distant horizon, you wonder what lies beyond it. And sometimes, That simple curiosity becomes the beginning of an entirely different life. Because for a fortunate few, childhood would eventually lead far beyond the familiar village. To castles. To monasteries. To great cities. Or even to journeys they could never have imagined beside their family's quiet hearth. Let's talk about fear. Not the kind created by horror stories. The ordinary kind. The kind that quietly lived beside almost every medieval child. Imagine waking one morning and noticing that your younger sister feels unusually warm. By evening, she has a fever. Nobody owns a thermometer. Nobody knows the names of bacteria or viruses. Nobody understands germs. Illness arrives almost like the weather. Sometimes it stays for a day. Sometimes for a week. Sometimes someone never gets out of bed again. As a child, you don't understand why. You only know that adults suddenly begin whispering. Your mother places cool cloths on your sister's forehead. Your father walks farther than usual to gather herbs from someone believed to understand healing. Perhaps the village healer visits. Perhaps the local priest says prayers. Everyone does what they believe might help. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Life teaches difficult lessons early. Children learn that not every problem has an answer. Not every injury heals perfectly. Not every winter ends with the same number of people gathered around the fire. Yet life continues. It always must. The animals still need feeding. The bread still needs baking. The fields still demand attention. Grief becomes another part of ordinary life. Not because medieval people loved their families less. Quite the opposite. They loved deeply. Surviving letters, church records, and personal writings show parents mourning children with heartbreaking tenderness. Children mourned parents. Brothers mourned sisters. Loss was familiar. But affection was just as real. That affection appeared in quiet ways. A father placing his coat over a sleeping child during a cold evening. A mother saving the softest piece of bread for her youngest son. An older sister carrying her little brother across a muddy path. These moments rarely appeared in grand histories. Kings filled the history books. Ordinary families filled everyday life. Children also feared storms. Lightning crashing across open fields. Violent winds tearing at thatched roofs. Floods swallowing crops that represented months of work. Nature was not something safely viewed through a window. Nature entered your home. Sometimes literally. A single failed harvest could change everything. Food became scarcer. Meals became smaller. Adults smiled less. Children noticed every change. Even if no one explained it. Yet despite these fears, childhood somehow remained full of wonder. You still chased butterflies across meadows. You still laughed when puppies stumbled over their own feet. You still watched the first snowfall with wide eyes. You still believed that distant forests held mysterious secrets waiting to be discovered. Children have always found joy. Even in difficult worlds. Perhaps especially in difficult worlds. Because joy did not require comfort. Only curiosity. And medieval children possessed plenty of that. As another evening settles over your village, the familiar smell of wood smoke drifts through the cool air. The church bell rings softly in the distance. Families gather once more around glowing fires. Tomorrow will bring more work. More learning. More uncertainty. But also another sunrise. Another chance to run across familiar fields. Another story beside the hearth. Another ordinary day. And for one medieval child, that was enough. Now let's talk about learning. Because medieval children were constantly being educated. They simply wouldn't have called it education. Imagine following your grandmother into the nearby woods just after sunrise. She walks slowly. Not because she's tired. Because she's looking. Every few steps she pauses beside a plant. She points without saying much. This one. You kneel beside her. The leaves look almost identical to 3 others growing nearby. Yet she immediately notices the difference. One plant helps soothe stomach pain. Another can flavor soup. The third should never be eaten at all. To you, they all looked green. To her, they are completely different. This knowledge doesn't come from books. Your grandmother cannot read. She doesn't need to. Everything she knows has been carried in memory. Her own grandmother taught her. Just as she is now teaching you. One day, you will teach someone else. That is how knowledge survives. The same happens in every part of village life. Your father doesn't explain farming through long lectures. He simply hands you a wooden hoe. Watch. You watch. He plants one row. Then another. You copy him. The first row is crooked. He quietly straightens it. You try again. A little better. By the end of summer, your hands remember movements your mind barely notices anymore. Learning becomes part of your muscles. Not just your thoughts. The blacksmith teaches exactly the same way. The baker. The shepherd. The carpenter. Everyone learns by doing. Mistakes aren't failures. They're expected. Provided you don't make the same one twice. Children become remarkably observant. You notice which clouds usually bring rain. You recognize birds by their songs. You learn where rabbits prefer to hide. You discover which trees lose their leaves first. Without realizing it, you become an expert in your own tiny corner of the world. Modern children often memorize maps showing entire continents. You probably couldn't draw Europe. But you know every footpath within 5 miles. Every shortcut through the woods. Every stream shallow enough to cross after heavy rain. Knowledge isn't measured by distance. It's measured by usefulness. Occasionally, a traveling priest visits carrying books. Real books. Not many. Perhaps only 1 or 2. The pages seem almost magical. Covered with beautiful letters and colorful illustrations. You stare in amazement. Some children dream about learning to read. A fortunate few eventually do. Most never have the opportunity. Yet literacy is only one kind of intelligence. A shepherd who understands hundreds of sheep. A healer who recognizes dozens of medicinal plants. A carpenter who builds a roof that survives 30 winters. These people possess knowledge every bit as valuable. The Middle Ages simply measured wisdom differently. As evening approaches, you realize something surprising. You have learned dozens of new things today. No classroom. No homework. No examinations. Just another ordinary day. And another quiet step toward adulthood. Because every sunrise teaches something new. Even when nobody realizes a lesson has begun. Let's spend our final few moments together beside the fire. The day is over. The animals are quiet. The fields have disappeared into the darkness. One by one, the conversations become softer. Children begin drifting towards sleep. You are one of them. You lie down on a mattress stuffed with straw. It is not especially comfortable. But after a day spent walking, carrying, digging, climbing, fetching water, chasing birds from the fields, and helping your family from sunrise until sunset, comfort matters less than rest. Someone pulls a rough wool blanket over your shoulders. The fire has burned down to glowing embers. Orange light dances across the wooden walls. Outside, the wind moves gently through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls into the night. You have heard that sound every evening for as long as you can remember. It no longer frightens you. It simply means night has arrived. Tomorrow, you already know what will happen. You will wake before sunrise. The cottage will still smell faintly of smoke. The fire will need tending. Water will need carrying. Animals will need feeding. The fields will still be waiting. At first glance, that kind of life may seem repetitive. Perhaps even unimaginably difficult. And in many ways, it was. Medieval childhood demanded responsibility earlier than modern childhood. It offered fewer possessions. Less comfort. Less certainty. Many children never traveled beyond neighboring villages. Many never learned to read. Many experienced hardships that are difficult for us to imagine today. But history is rarely only one thing. Because alongside the hardship, there was belonging. Children grew up surrounded by grandparents, cousins, neighbors, and lifelong friends. They learned practical skills that connected them directly to the world around them. They knew every season, every tree, every bird song, every familiar face walking down the village path. They belonged completely to a place. Modern life has given us extraordinary things: medicine, education, safety, warm homes, electric lights, the ability to speak with people living on the other side of the world in an instant. Few people would willingly exchange those comforts for medieval life. Yet, something else has quietly faded: the deep rhythm of living alongside nature, the closeness of entire communities, the feeling that every person, regardless of age, had a meaningful place within the group. Perhaps that is why medieval childhood continues to fascinate us. Not because we wish to return there, but because it reminds us how remarkably adaptable human beings have always been. Generation after generation, children laughed, learned, worked, played, dreamed, and slowly became the adults who would raise the next generation in exactly the same way. Most of their names have disappeared from history. No statues were built for them. No chronicles recorded their ordinary afternoons. Yet they were the people who planted the fields, built the cottages, raised the families, passed on the stories, and quietly carried medieval Europe from one century to the next. So tonight, as you settle beneath your own warm blanket, in a home filled with comforts those children could never have imagined, perhaps spare one peaceful thought for the millions of ordinary boys and girls whose lives shaped history without ever appearing inside it. Their world has vanished, but their story still echoes softly across the centuries. Good night.